My name is Emma Collins. I'm 41 years old, and I learned a long time ago that people like Richard only feel powerful when somebody else breaks first. That night, Ava didn't. We were barely halfway through dinner at my parents' house when Richard decided to turn my daughter into entertainment. The smell of roasted chicken still hung in the air. My mother had spent all afternoon cooking. My father was trying to keep conversation alive with awkward questions about traffic and weather, while Natalie kept bragging about her son Mason like he'd personally invented success. Meanwhile, Ava sat quietly beside me in a dark sweater, listening more than talking, exactly the way she always did. Richard leaned back in his chair with that smug expression he wore whenever he thought he was the smartest person in the room. "Ava's still working at that burger place, right?" he asked casually. I already knew where this was going. "Yeah," I answered carefully. "And taking business classes at night." Richard snorted. "Business classes," he repeated. "Come on, Emma, let's be honest. Your daughter's the kind of girl who'll be flipping burgers forever." Natalie laughed so hard she nearly spilled her wine. "Oh my God," she said. "Richard." But she wasn't embarrassed. She was enjoying it. Across the table, my mother stiffened immediately. My father stared down at his plate. "And Ava?" She simply took another sip of water. That calmness irritated Richard even more. Men like him needed visible damage. They needed flinching, shame, tears. Ava gave him nothing. I looked directly at my brother-in-law and smiled softly. "And yet," I said, "my daughter isn't living in my basement, drowning in maxed-out credit cards." The silence that followed felt physical. Richard's expression changed instantly. Natalie's smile disappeared. Even the sound of silverware stopped. Because everybody knew I was talking about Mason. 22 years old. No stable job. Late rent every month. 3 failed community college attempts. And enough credit card debt to make collection agencies practically part of the family. Richard opened his mouth, probably ready to start another argument, but I was already reaching into my purse. I pulled out a white envelope and slid it across the table toward my parents. My father frowned. "What's this?" "Open it." My mother carefully pulled out the papers inside. Then her hand flew to her mouth. It was a reservation confirmation for a 3-night stay at a lakefront cabin she'd been dreaming about visiting for nearly 10 years. Paid in full. My father blinked in confusion. "You bought this?" he asked me. I shook my head. "Ava did." My mother looked stunned. "With your work money?" she whispered. Ava nodded quietly. "You always wanted to go," she said softly. "I figured it was time." Nobody spoke after that. Natalie started swirling her wine again, like she suddenly found the glass fascinating. Richard stared at Ava differently now. Not kindly. Not proudly. Just uncertain. Like he realized he'd miscalculated something important. Mason wasn't there that night. Apparently, he was busy, which usually meant sleeping off a hangover or avoiding responsibility somewhere. But honestly, that almost made the moment worse for Richard. Because the daughter he mocked had just given my parents something meaningful, while his own son couldn't even bother showing up for dinner. The rest of the evening dragged awkwardly after that. Richard barely spoke. Natalie kept forcing fake cheerfulness into conversations nobody wanted anymore. And Ava stayed exactly the same. Quiet. Polite. Calm. She helped my mother clear dishes afterward without being asked, kissed her cheek goodbye, then grabbed her jacket and told me she needed to be up by 5 in the morning. I knew why. I'd known for months, but I hadn't told anyone yet. Not even my parents. Because Ava wasn't ready. 6 months earlier, I'd noticed something changing in her. She started picking up extra shifts constantly, delivery driving after work, freelance graphic design online late at night, saving every dollar with frightening discipline. Whenever I asked why, she'd only smile slightly and say the same thing. It's for the plan. At first, I assumed she meant school tuition or maybe a car. Then one night, she came into the kitchen carrying a thick folder and asked if I would co-sign a commercial lease. I honestly thought she was joking, until she spread everything across the table.
Blueprints,
Budgets,
marketing concepts,
vendor contracts, projected labor costs, a complete restaurant business model. I remember staring at her for nearly a full minute. You did all this yourself? She looked nervous for the first time in months. I've been studying, she said quietly. At work, too, not just school. That was when I realized something nobody else had. Ava wasn't stuck working fast food. She was studying it from the inside. She noticed inefficiencies managers ignored: employee burnout, wasteful systems, cheap ingredients hidden beneath expensive branding. She learned how customers moved, what they ordered, how timing worked during rushes. While everyone else looked down on her job, Ava was turning it into an education. 3 months later, she signed the lease. A tiny downtown location. Nothing flashy, but hers.
completely independent.
She hired 2 coworkers from her old restaurant almost immediately because, according to her, good workers deserve better management. I remember crying in my bedroom the night she officially opened. Not because I doubted her, because I suddenly realized my daughter had quietly become someone extraordinary while the rest of the family was too busy underestimating her to notice. And after that dinner with Richard, something shifted inside her. The next afternoon, Ava came home exhausted from work and sat across from me at the kitchen table. Sunlight spilled through the blinds across her face while she stared down at her coffee cup. Then she finally said it. I think I'm ready to tell everyone. I looked at her carefully. You sure? She nodded slowly. Not arrogantly. Not dramatically. Just certain. Then she smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile people use when they want applause. It was the smile of someone who spent months building something quietly, while everyone else assumed she was failing. And for the first time in a long while, I think Ava was done hiding. 2 weeks later, it was my mother's birthday again. A smaller gathering this time. Just immediate family. My parents, me and Ava, Natalie and Richard, and Mason, who actually showed up for once. He arrived 10 minutes late, wearing sunglasses indoors and acting like attendance itself was a gift. Natalie kept touching his arm proudly, as if he'd returned from war instead of probably waking up at noon. Ava walked in carrying a large bouquet and a gift box tied with a silver ribbon. She handed both to my mother. Happy birthday, Grandma. My mother's whole face softened. The gift was a full dinnerware set she had mentioned years earlier, the kind she always admired in catalogs but never bought because she said it was too expensive. How did you manage this? Mom asked. Ava only smiled. I've been saving. That one sentence alone was enough to disturb the image Richard and Natalie had worked so hard to build around her. But it wasn't the real reveal. After dinner, everyone moved into the living room. Mason slouched on the couch, scrolling through his phone. Natalie sat beside Richard, with her wine glass balanced delicately in one hand. Richard had been unusually quiet all night, but I could tell he was still chewing on what happened 2 weeks earlier. Ava stood near the coffee table, holding a small box. My heart started beating faster. I didn't know she'd planned it this way. She looked at my mother first. You taught me that generosity matters, Ava said softly. Even when people don't have much, they still choose what kind of heart they want to have. My mother's eyes filled immediately. Then Ava turned to the rest of the room. I've been working on something for about a year, she said. I didn't want to talk about it until I knew it was stable. She opened the box and pulled out a stack of promo cards. One by one, she passed them around. Richard took his like it was junk mail. Then he actually looked at it.
The Grill.
A modern fast-casual burger restaurant downtown. Clean logo.
Full color design.
On the back was a photo of the storefront. Her storefront. I opened my own place 2 months ago, Ava said. We've paid off the initial lease costs, hired 3 staff members, and we're breaking even. Nobody moved. My father stared at the card like it was a winning lottery ticket. My mother covered her mouth again. Natalie read the card twice, her expression tightening with each second. Richard looked up slowly. You opened this? Ava nodded. No loans, she said. No investors. I saved my paychecks, did freelance design work, worked delivery routes, took business classes at night, and reinvested everything. My father's voice cracked slightly. You did all that without telling us? I wanted to prove it first. That was Ava. She didn't want praise for an idea. She wanted results. My mother stood and hugged her so tightly, Ava almost dropped the remaining cards. For a moment, the room felt warm. Then Richard laughed.
Short. Dry. Ugly.
Must be nice, he said, playing entrepreneur with your mother's help. Before I could even speak, Ava answered. She didn't fund it. Richard's jaw tightened. She co-signed the lease, that's it, not $1. I watched his face harden, because there was nowhere to place the insult anymore. Then Ava turned toward Mason and held out one of the cards. If you're ever looking for work, we're hiring, she said. You'd start at the register like I did. Mason finally looked up from his phone. For half a second, embarrassment crossed his face. Then he gave a weak laugh and placed the card on the coffee table like it burned his fingers. Yeah, cool. Natalie looked furious. Richard looked humiliated. And Ava looked peaceful. That was the part they couldn't stand. She wasn't trying to defeat them. She simply existed in a way that proved them wrong. The night ended with stiff goodbyes. Natalie hugged my mother too tightly and smiled too wide. Richard barely spoke. Mason disappeared outside first, mumbling something about friends. Ava stayed behind to help clean, like always. Before we left, she told my mother she'd come by next week and cook dinner using the new plates. My mother lit up like Ava had given her the moon. On the drive home, Ava stared out the window quietly. I finally asked, "Do you feel better now that they know?" She didn't turn toward me. I didn't do it for them. That was my daughter in one sentence. No performance. No revenge speech. No desperate need for applause. She just didn't want to hide anymore. But the storm had already started. The next morning, my mother called. Natalie and Richard had shown up at her house angry. Richard said I had set him up. Natalie claimed Ava was trying to make Mason look bad in front of the family. My mother, who had always been gentle to a fault, finally snapped. She told them nobody needed to make Mason look bad. He was doing that all by himself. Later that week, I heard more from a friend who knew the temp agency Mason used. He had been fired, again. Late arrivals. Missed shifts. No call, no show. Richard and Natalie were still paying his rent, phone bill, car insurance, and credit cards. Worse, Richard had maxed out 2 cards and opened another behind Natalie's back. Their polished life wasn't polished at all. It was paper thin, and Ava had walked through it without even trying. Then Natalie texted me. Must be nice raising a little show off. Hope she enjoys it before everything crashes down. I showed Ava. She read it once. Then she looked up at me and said, completely calmly, "Guess I should invite them to the soft launch of the second location." I blinked. Second location? Ava nodded. We've had a good couple of months. There's a spot across town. Lease is being finalized this week. For a second, I couldn't speak. Richard had mocked my daughter for flipping burgers. But Ava was about to flip the entire script. I didn't expect to see Richard again so soon. After Natalie's bitter messages and Mason disappearing into whatever disaster he usually called a social life, I assumed they'd avoid us for a while. But some people don't retreat when their pride gets wounded. They panic. And panic makes people desperate. It was a Thursday afternoon when I stopped by Ava's restaurant with paperwork for the second location. The lunch rush had just ended. The air still smelled like grilled onions and fresh fries, while employees cleaned tables and restocked supplies. The place was beautiful. Not flashy.
Professional.
Clean black and wood interior, bright menu screens, organized staff moving with confidence, customers still trickling in despite the rush being over. And Ava? She moved through it all calmly, like she had been running restaurants her entire life. I sat near the counter sipping iced tea while she talked with one of her employees about inventory updates for the new location. Then the front door opened. Richard walked in alone. No Natalie. No fake confidence. Just him standing there in business clothes, looking strangely uncomfortable. His eyes swept slowly across the restaurant. The branded packaging. The steady customers. The employees who clearly respected Ava. Everything real. Everything successful. Everything he once laughed at. Ava noticed him immediately, but didn't react dramatically. She simply nodded once and finished speaking with her employee before walking toward the counter. Richard stepped closer, carefully. "This is really yours?" he asked. Ava wiped her hands on a towel. "Yeah." He looked around again, almost dazed. Then he said quietly, "So you actually did all this?" No sarcasm. No insult. Just disbelief. Ava nodded once. Richard picked up a menu from the counter and stared at it for a few seconds, before finally speaking again. "Mason wants to work here." I nearly choked on my drink. Ava stayed completely still. Richard swallowed hard before continuing. "He says he wants to get his life together. We told him he needs a real job." His voice tightened slightly. "He asked if you'd consider hiring him." There it was. The collapse hidden inside the request. Their golden child had run out of excuses. And now they were standing in the restaurant built by the girl they mocked asking for help. Ava glanced at me briefly before looking back at Richard. "I'll interview him like anyone else," she said. Richard nodded slowly. That arrogant superiority he always carried around was gone now, worn down piece by piece. For a second, I thought he might actually thank her. He didn't. He simply placed the menu back on the counter and walked out. Later that night, Ava and I locked up together. Streetlights reflected against the restaurant windows while she flipped the sign from open to closed. "You really going to hire him?" I asked. "I'll give him a chance if he shows up. You know he's not like you." Ava locked the front door. "I'm not babysitting him," she said quietly. "But everybody deserves one real opportunity." The next morning, Mason arrived 30 minutes late. Of course he did. He walked inside, half-zipped hoodie, expensive sneakers, carrying a smoothie like he was visiting a mall instead of showing up for work. Ava glanced at the clock. "You're late." No anger. No lecture. Just fact. Mason smirked slightly. Traffic. But Ava had already returned to setting up registers. That became the tone immediately. No special treatment. No family privilege. No emotional softness because they shared blood. She handed him the same training packet every new employee received.
Schedules.
Rules. Expectations. 3-strike probation policy. Week 1 was a disaster. Mason forgot to restock napkins twice. Left a freezer door cracked open overnight. Missed an entire morning shift because he overslept. That earned him his first written warning. And Ava actually printed it. I watched Mason stare at the paper in disbelief. "You're seriously writing me up?" "You missed a shift," Ava replied calmly. "Everybody gets documented the same way." I asked her later if she regretted hiring him. She shook her head immediately. "If I want this business to mean something, I have to run it properly. Doesn't matter who someone's related to." That answer hit me harder than she realized. Because Ava wasn't just building a restaurant anymore. She was building discipline, standards,
Leadership.
things Richard and Natalie never taught their own son. Then something unexpected happened. During the second week, Mason showed up early one morning. Actually, early. He swept the parking lot before opening without being asked. Started paying attention during rush hours. Asked questions about inventory systems and register reports instead of staring at his phone. By week 3, he was arriving 5 minutes before shifts consistently. No dramatic transformation. No emotional speeches. Just small changes. Quiet ones. The kind that matter most. I think, for the first time in his life, someone expected something real from him. And strangely, he responded to it. Natalie hated every second of it. She showed up at my mother's house one Sunday, furious. According to Mom, Natalie paced around the kitchen, ranting about how humiliating it was for her son to work in food service. She said the words food service like they were poison. Then she accused Ava of manipulating Mason somehow. My mother finally lost patience. "Ava offered your son something nobody else has," she told her. "A clean slate." Natalie apparently went silent after that. Then Mom delivered the line that stayed with me for days. "Generosity like that doesn't come from weakness. It comes from strength." Mason kept working. Day after day. Slowly improving. 60 days later, Ava officially removed him from probation and handed him a black uniform shirt instead of the gray trainee version. It was such a small thing. But Mason stared at that shirt for several seconds before speaking. "So, this means I stay?" Ava nodded. "You earned it." I saw something shift in his face right then. Not pride. Not ego.
Relief.
Because maybe nobody had ever looked him in the eye before and told him he earned something honestly. A week later, Ava turned 20. She held the birthday dinner at the restaurant after closing hours. The second location was already under renovation, and the original store was thriving harder than ever. I invited the entire family. Honestly, I wasn't sure who would come, but they all did. My parents. Me. Mason. Even Richard. Natalie claimed she had a migraine. Personally, I think she simply couldn't sit inside that restaurant without confronting how wrong she'd been. Throughout dinner, Richard barely spoke. He kept glancing around the restaurant quietly, like he still couldn't believe it belonged to Ava, the girl he once dismissed so casually. After dessert, Ava stood slowly from her chair. The entire room quieted immediately. Then she looked directly at Mason. "You've come a long way," she said softly. "Thanks for stepping up." Mason looked stunned, almost emotional. Then, awkwardly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black box. Inside was a steel keychain shaped like the EV Grill logo. On the back were 2 engraved words. Day 1. "I know I wasn't really around before," Mason muttered quietly, "but thanks for not giving up on me." Nobody spoke for a second. The moment was too real, too honest. And somehow that quiet exchange hit harder than any dramatic apology ever could. After everyone finished dessert, people slowly started gathering their coats and saying their goodbyes. The restaurant lights reflected softly against the windows, while the last warmth of the evening lingered in the air. My parents were still smiling. My mother kept touching Ava's arm every few minutes, like she still couldn't fully believe this place belonged to her granddaughter. Mason stayed near the counter, helping stack chairs without being asked. That alone would have been unimaginable a few months earlier. Richard stood quietly near the exit, with his hands in his pockets, watching everything. Watching Ava. Watching the employees who respected her. Watching the customers' photos framed near the register. Watching the life she built out of the exact thing he once mocked. Eventually, everyone headed outside, except Richard. He lingered near the doorway awkwardly. Then he looked at Ava. "Can we talk for a minute?" My stomach tightened instantly. Ava glanced at him calmly, before nodding once. The 2 of them stepped outside, near the alley behind the restaurant, where employees usually took breaks. I stayed near the front window, pretending to wipe down a table while secretly watching them. Neither raised their voice. Neither looked angry. It was strangely quiet. Richard spoke first. I could tell by the way his shoulders moved. Ava listened without interrupting. Then, finally, after a long pause, Richard rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly and looked down at the pavement. I had known him for nearly 20 years, and I don't think I had ever seen him look smaller. Not weak. Just honest. For once. A few minutes later, he reached his hand out toward Ava. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just sincerely. Ava shook it. That was it. No tears. No movie speech. No giant emotional reconciliation. Just accountability. And somehow, that made it matter more. When Ava finally came back inside, I looked at her immediately. What did he say? She grabbed a towel and started wiping the counter casually. He said he was wrong. I waited. That's it? Ava nodded once. That's all I needed. And somehow, that was enough for me too. Because the truth was, Ava had already won long before that apology happened. She won the moment she refused to let bitterness turn her cruel. She won when she stayed quiet while people underestimated her. She won when she built something real instead of wasting energy proving people wrong. And most importantly, she won when she helped the same cousin who once silently watched her humiliation. That was the part I kept thinking about afterward. Ava could have embarrassed Mason, could have rejected him, could have reminded everyone how they treated her. Instead, she handed him an opportunity, a clean slate, something most people never receive twice. Over the next few months, things slowly changed across the family. Not perfectly. Families are never perfect, but differently. Richard stopped making cruel jokes at dinners, actually listened when other people spoke. My mother said he'd started working extra consulting hours quietly because their finances had gotten worse than anyone realized. Apparently, he and Natalie had spent years pretending everything was stable while debt piled up behind closed doors. Natalie remained harder, more defensive, more fragile. I think watching Ava succeed forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself, about Mason, maybe even about the life she built around appearances. But even she slowly stopped making comments. Because eventually, reality becomes too obvious to argue with. Meanwhile, Mason kept working. And to everyone's shock, except maybe Ava's, he became good at it. Not extraordinary. Not suddenly transformed into a business genius. Just dependable.
Consistent.
Responsible.
For the first time in his life, he started finishing things instead of abandoning them halfway through. One afternoon, I stopped by the restaurant unexpectedly and found him training a new employee patiently through the register system. I stood there silently watching for nearly a minute. Because this was the same boy who once couldn't show up anywhere on time. The same boy Richard and Natalie protected from consequences his entire life. And somehow, the person who finally helped him grow up was the cousin they mocked for flipping burgers forever. Life has a strange sense of irony. Ava's second location officially opened 4 months later. The launch night was packed. Lines out the door. Music playing softly. Employees rushing everywhere. I stood near the back, watching Ava move through the chaos with calm confidence, while customers congratulated her nonstop. At one point, she caught me staring. "What?" she asked with a small smile. I shook my head. "I'm just thinking." "About what?" I looked around the restaurant slowly. About the nights she came home exhausted, smelling like fryer oil. About the cruel jokes. About Richard laughing across my parents' dinner table. About everyone who thought quiet meant weak. Then I looked back at my daughter. The girl they laughed at built all this. Ava smiled faintly. Then she said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "They were laughing at the job," she said softly. I was paying attention to the opportunity. That was Ava. Always seeing something deeper than everyone else. And honestly, that's why she changed all of us. Not through revenge. Not through humiliation. Not through screaming louder than anyone else. She changed this family because she kept showing up while everyone else talked. She stayed disciplined while other people chased appearances. She built quietly, worked quietly, endured quietly, and when the moment finally came, her actions spoke louder than every insult ever thrown at her. The daughter they mocked for flipping burgers forever became the strongest person in the room. Not because she wanted power, but because she never stopped moving forward while everyone else underestimated her.